And we're picking up with the 17th chapter of the fourth part of Silver on the Tree by Susan Cooper. The name of this part is the Midsummer Tree. The name of this chapter is The Train. And Merriman has just said it is a time train that he and two of the Drew children and Bloodwind and John Rowlands are traveling on. Something is up with Bloodwind Rowland. She's knitting, and Jane is a little bit scared of what's going on. Maroons! John Rowland said in astonishment. The old maroon's going off. That they used to put on the track for fog warnings. He looked out of the window, and indeed, that sky is so grey it might as well be fog now. The brakes skirled at the train's wheels, the flying landscape slowed, and suddenly the whirling riders were lost in the cloud. Grey cloud was everywhere, and swirling mist. Hissing, rattling, the train slowed to a crawl, and all at once a little station was slipping up to them outside the windows. Simon jumped up, pulling Jane out of the corridor. They peered out. The station seemed to be a single platform in the middle of nowhere, without a name and only a single arch-like structure, indefinite in the mist. Beyond, dimly visible through a gap in the cloud, a long hill rose on the horizon ahead. Then slowly, gradually, three vague forms emerged from the arch. Simon stared at them. "Quick, Jane, open the door!" He lunged past her and turned the long handle, thrusting the door outward, reaching down, and Will and Bran and Barney climbed into the train. "Oh!" Jane said, quite unable to say anything else, and she gave Barney a quick, hard hug. And to her surprise, Barney hugged her back. The train began to move, and clouds and swirls of mist came swooping round the platform and dim arch, as if all were dissolving into emptiness, and from the compartment behind them, Bloodwind Rowlands' musical voice said in pleasure, "Well, Bran, Cariad, how lovely. Are the trials in Shrewsbury then? John never said." "I was telling Bloodwind yesterday," John Rowland's deep, careful voice broke in before Bran could speak, "about you boys going to help Idris Jones Tybalt with getting the sheep to the sheepdog trials. His turn to supply them for the heats. It is, having no dogs of his own entered this year. I think he is chairman, isn't it, Bran?" "Yes," Bran said smoothly as they crowded into the compartment. "And we had to pick up a few more sheep out here. So no more room for us on the lorry, and Mr. Jones put us on the train. Surprised to see you now." "And the little one going too. Now there's fun for him," said Mrs. Rowland, smiling at Barney, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for him to be helping herd sheep. Barney smiled dutifully back, said nothing, but slid into the space beside Simon. The train swayed and sang, rushing at full speed again. The mass of the long, low hill was rising ahead. Now like a wall, the grey clouds swept overhead, hollow-throated. Jane saw the riders again, crowds and streams of them, flying through the sky. Panic gripped her. Where were they riding to? Where was the train rushing? Where? "Sit by me, lovey," Mrs. Rowland said to Bran, an affectionate tug at his arm, bringing him down abruptly on the seat beside her and Jane. Hastily making room, Jane wondered if the sword were still in the scabbard unseen at Bran's side. Will stood swaying in the doorway, one hand on either side of the doorframe. He said, looking at Merriman as if at a stranger, "Many people on this train?" "It is really quite full," Merriman said with the same stiff politeness, and suddenly the engine gave a great shriek, and the train dived under a hill. In one gulp, a tunnel swallowed it, and darkness was all around, a low roaring close in their ears, the sulphurous train smell filling the air they breathed. Jane had a quick glimpse of apprehension on Mrs. Rowlands' pleasant face. Then she forgot it in the overwhelming, vivid sense of the way they were driving into the earth. Through the mountain, tons after tons and fathoms of rock as the train's track carried them inexorably on. Gradually she began to feel that they were no longer in a train at all, that the bounds of the small box-like room in which they sat were beginning to fade. Everyone was there still, the figures sitting, and Will surveying them from what had been the doorway. But now a strange glow had begun all around them, as if it were their speed made visible, as if the glow itself were whirling them along. She felt that they were rushing through the earth, riding on some power of their own, and a great company of people with them, all flying helter-skelter eastward. The glow of light around them grew and grew, became bright. They were contained in brightness, as if they rode on a river of light. Jane saw wonder and incomprehension on John Rowland's strong, weather-lined face. Bloodwind Rowlands gave a sudden whimper of fear. She scrambled to her feet, dropping her knitting on the floor, and lurched over to sit by his side. Rowlands put a comforting arm around her, the support of long affection. "There now, carry on," he said. "There now, don't be afraid, just rest easy and trust him. Will's Mr. Merriman will keep us out of harm." Both Will and Merriman now, Jane saw in astonishment, were on their feet and standing before Bloodwind Rowlands, both motionless, yet giving an impression of immense silent menace, the menace of accusation. Behind them, Brand stood up slowly, and with the same curious play-acting gesture as Jane remembered from the beach, he drew the invisible sword from the invisible scabbard at his side, and suddenly the sword was there, terrible, naked, gleaming, and the length of its crystal blade was flickering with blue fire. Bloodwind Rowlands shrank back, pressing against her husband's side. "What is it?" said John Rowlands in angry distress, staring up at Merriman's silent, towering form. "Keep them away from me," Mrs. Rowlands cried. "John!" John Rowlands could not stand up with the weight of her pressing him back, but he seemed to grow more upright as he stared at them. Accusing, reproachful. "Leave her alone now, you people. Whatever you are doing. What has she to do with your concerns? She is my wife, and I will not have her frightened. Leave her alone." Brand stretched out the tip of the sword Arias, with the blue flames dancing up and down its length, and held it so the tip was between Will and Merriman, pointing at Bloodwind Rowlands' contorted face. "Cowardly it is," he said in a cold adult voice, "to shelter behind those who love you without giving love in return. Very clever, of course, almost as clever as being in the right place to help the growing up of a strange pale boy out of the past and making sure he never does or says or thinks anything without your knowing all about it." "What is the matter with you, Bran?" said John Rowlands in anguished appeal. The brightness carried them on, singing like the train hollow in the hill. Merriman said in his deep voice, expressionless, "She belongs to the dark." "You're mad!" John Rowlands' hand tightened on his wife's arm. "Our hostage," Will said, as the White Rider of the Dark took Barney hostage, thinking to get Bran and the sword in exchange. "A hostage for our safe running now." "Safe running!" Bloodwind Rowlands said in a new soft voice and laughed. John Rowlands sat very still, and Jane winced at the horrified disbelief beginning to dawn in his eyes. Mrs. Rowlands' laughter was cold, and her voice was all at once oddly different, sibilant, but with a new force behind it. Jane could not believe that it was coming from the familiar, warm, friendly face. She could still see. "Safe running," said the voice, laughing. "You run to your destruction, all of you, and the sword will be no savior. The dark is masked and waiting, with your hostage here to guide it. Risen and waiting, Lion, Stanton, Pendragon. Risen and waiting. And not all your things of power will help you to the tree when you rush out of the earth in a moment now when the dark force falls upon you." She stood up, John Rowland's hand dropping limp away from her to lie on the seat like a discarded glove while he sat there appalled and staring. She seemed to Jane taller, gleaming in the misty brightness with a light of her own. Deliberately, Bloodwind Rowlands moved toward the point of the sword. Arias and Brand slowly put up the sword, letting the point rise so that it would not touch her, and Will and Merriman moved aside. "Arias may not destroy the Lords of the Dark," Bloodwind Rowlands said triumphantly. "None but the dark may destroy the dark," Will said. "That is part of the law that we have not forgotten." Merriman took one step forward. Suddenly he was the focus of everything around them. Of all the six, of all the power and intention of the light driving through the stone and land toward its mysterious goal, he stood tall in the brightness, his white hair gleaming above the long cloak of dark blue that he wore now, and he raised one arm and pointed at Bloodwind Rowlands. "The light throws you from this stream of time," he said, his voice ringing as the song of the train had rung through the hollow land. "We drive you before us, out, and save yourself as best you can, when you fly forth ahead of this great progress, and the terrible force of your dark falls upon you, thinking to ambush the light." Excuse me. Budwin Rollins gave a thin cry of rage, the sound of it clutching Jane by the throat with horror, and she seemed to spin round and change and whirl away into the dark space around them as a white-robed form on a galloping white horse, leaping high, caught up in fury and fear. The white rider rose out of the brightness in which they traveled and was gone ahead of them into a misty darkness where nothing could be seen. And that's the end of chapter 17.